Friday, March 13th. Friday the 13th was the day that we learned that the schools in our district would be closed. So we did not know at that, we were just talking about this before church, we did not know at that time how long it would be, and there's still uncertainty about how they will reopen this fall. But we found out that Friday at the end of school, and we learned that there would be no school on Monday or Tuesday of the following week, and then on Wednesday, school reopened with virtual or remote or distance learning, whatever you want to call it. Teachers had 4 days to turn that around. God bless them. Friday at the end of school, by Wednesday, they had to shift all of their plans for any lessons plans that they had for what they would be doing in person. And they had to switch to some kind of virtual lesson. They had to learn new technology and new apps. Thankfully, our school actually already has iPads for everybody from kindergarten on up, and they use those, so there were some things kids were familiar with and the teachers were familiar with, but they had to learn new ways to teach kids and meet the needs of different and diverse populations, kids who have different needs, digitally when they could no longer meet together physically in a building. And I stand in awe and amazement of those teachers and the administration and the IT staff and the tech support and all of the administrative assistants and all of the people in those schools who did that with such agility. It wasn't perfect. We didn't love it. But given the short notice and the lack of preparation time and the lack of training most of them had, this is not the kind of teaching they learned about when they were in college to become educators. It was so impressive to me how they just pivoted and adapted on a dime to this vastly different situation. We come today to Isaiah 42 and we find the Israelites who are knee-deep in a similar, analogous kind of situation. They're living in exile in Babylon, which is a foreign land, a foreign culture. They have been carted off into captivity, and this is not like anything that they have known before. It is nothing they could have prepared for. I mean, God did warn them. God sent prophets, so it wasn't completely out of the blue, but still it was a shock when it actually happened. And they had no control over when this situation started. They had no way to predict when it would end. By the time we catch up with them, they've been living in these circumstances for a while. And here they are in exile, and while they are living in Babylon, they have suddenly had to figure out new ways to be God's faithful people in a very different context. They had to change their understanding of what it means to follow God when their religious life could no longer be centered around a building and what happened in the temple in Jerusalem. Does that sound familiar to anyone? In this time of pandemic, we have experienced, like the school teachers at my kids' school and everywhere, like the people of ancient Israel, we have experienced these abrupt changes that we have had little to no control over. We have had to adapt as a church to what it means to be a people and a community of faith who cannot gather in person the way that we always have, who haven't until, the past month and a half been able to worship together. And now in our cars and on the lawn and in this modified fashion. And we have had to realize also that our life of faith cannot simply center around coming to this building behind me and what happens in that building. In the time of COVID, we have seen how important it is for us to adapt quickly as a congregation, to try some new things to allow us to continue to grow in our faith and to support one another and to reach out beyond our walls. It's been a challenging time. But these changes, these specific changes, are not the only changes that have been happening. Change with the church and the culture around us have been happening long, long, long before this current crisis started. The culture around us, some of you have, I've lived a while, and many of you have lived quite a while longer than I have, and you have seen these dramatic changes in our culture. And you have seen the way that the church's place in that culture has shifted. In many ways, the church finds itself in a foreign place, not knowing how to connect to a different culture, even though we are living in the same place. There are younger generations who speak a different language, it seems, the language of the digital and technology, who value different ways of being in the world and being in relationship with other people. The need for meaning and for a sense of identity and for belonging and community remains across all of these divides of generations, but the ways that people find and experience those things has changed. In the church, we haven't typically done a very good job of adapting to those changes and shifting our approach to meet people where they are so that they can hear God's love for them in a way that connects. We have not entirely yet figured out how to be God's faithful people who are called to share good news in this current reality. Today in our sermon series on faith practices, the practice is innovation. And the sentence from the statement is printed in your bulletin, but I'll read it again. It says, "We know that the church and our world are changing, and we need to take risks and explore new ways of being faithful, building relationships, and organizing our life together." It's a statement that was adopted in May 2019 at the Synod Assembly, so over a year ago, but that means it was being written and formulated even before that, so that it could be discussed and prepared and have people ready to vote on it. And what that says is that we know that the need for innovation is not a new need. It's not because of COVID that we need to change things. This statement speaks to something we all know is true, even though we're usually not comfortable with it. Even if we're not sure how we ought to change. Even if taking risks for the sake of the gospel feels risky. We know that it's true, even if we don't know what next steps to take in this faith practice of innovation. I don't know if we've even ever really thought about innovation as a part of our faith, right? As something that helps us to live out what we profess and believe. But innovating and adapting and changing, these are all things that are a part of the life of discipleship, a part of our call as God's people. The prophet Isaiah shares God's word with God's people who are living in exile in a dramatically changed world and says this. This is what God says through the prophet. "I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. See," God says, "the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare." God is not surprised by all of the changes that have been happening recently and in past decades. God is not surprised by the change and upheaval that the Israelites are experiencing. But God is not done with them yet. God has not abandoned them in this. God is declaring new things. God has called this people from the very beginning to be a people on a mission, to be a witness to the world of God's love, to be light bringers and eye openers and liberators of those who are kept captive. God has a plan and a purpose for those ancient Israelites who sit in confusion and loss and uncertainty while in exile. And Isaiah writes to comfort them and to call them out of that confusion, reminding them of God's vision of hope and redemption, inviting them once again to be a part of God's mission to heal and redeem and bless the whole world. And God will teach them along the way what it means to continue to live as God's faithful people who are rooted in tradition and history, but able to adapt and innovate to changing circumstances as they go. This is what it means for us to be followers of Jesus, too. As we live in this world that is so very different from the world that Jesus lived in a world that is different than the one many of us grew up in. And just as teachers, God bless them, will continue to have to adapt to new needs and new situations and just not even knowing what the heck's going to happen next month. And as the Israelites learned to be a people of faith in exile and returning to a different Jerusalem than the one they had known before, we too are called to dare to take risks, to try new things. I don't always know what those new things are, but to be in touch with our communities, to read our context, to risk failure as we try things. You know, sometimes we say, oh, well, we tried that once ago, 30 years ago, and it didn't work. So we can't try it again? We try something, it fails, and so we say, okay, we give up. Instead of trying, shifting, adapting, tweaking, we are called to continue to do that as we seek to live and share our faith in ways that a dark and hurting and anxious world desperately needs to know, and in ways that they can respond to. That is what Jesus did, after all, right? He cherished the law and the tradition. We hold fast to our traditions and our heritage and our history, and yet Jesus, when he came not to abolish that or to destroy the law, but to fulfill it, to complete it, to bring it to fruition. And so he went deeper and further and expanded the vision. He went in new directions with new people as he lived out his mission to share God's life-changing and healing love with everyone he met. And so in the church that often jokes, even as we know it's true, we've always done it this way, we recognize and know that a change has got to come. Because God doesn't call us to stay the same and just do the same things over and over and over again and expect somehow something will be different, right? Someone has called that the definition of insanity. But God is declaring new things in this time of the world, in this place with us as God's people. God is daring us to be creative and bold and think outside the box, to expand our vision of who God is calling us to be and who God is calling us to reach, so that we may pay closer attention to our surrounding neighborhood and the people we encounter in our everyday lives, and to join more fully in God's mission. God's call for us to share God's light and God's love and God's